But now I want to see how Aristotle uses the same basic concepts, form and matter, actuality and potentiality, in his discussion of psychology. And here the question, as you know, is what is the nature of the soul? Remember, psyche is the Greek for soul, and therefore psychology is the theory of the soul. Now you remember Plato. His view was that the soul is a substance, an entity, a self-contained entity, which is temporarily exists in the body, which is capable of independent existence in another world. And you remember Plato believed in reincarnation, the whole Pythagorean wheel of birth, and that there was for Plato a conflict, a basic metaphysical conflict between the soul and the body. More exactly, between the highest part of the soul, what Plato called reason, and the body and the bodily influenced elements of the soul. And on that basis, Plato drew his ethics of asceticism. The body is a prison, we should flee from sensory pleasures, philosophy is the practice of dying, etc. Now Aristotle, consistent with his basic approach to philosophy, wants to give a this-worldly account of the nature of the soul. A naturalistic, not a supernaturalistic account. And he starts with the ordinary Greek meaning of the term psyche, or soul. Soul, for the ordinary Greek on the street, meant the principle of life. It was not restricted to human beings or to conscious beings. It was the element responsible for life, whether possessed by a carrot, a dog, or a man. And, of course, where applicable, it was the element responsible for cognition. A thing which is alive in Greek is a thing which has a soul. And we still use that language today, although if you don't know Latin, you won't be familiar with it, because you call a living thing an animate thing. And animate is simply an English derivative of the Latin word anima, which is Latin for soul, the translation of the Greek psyche. And therefore, when you say something is inanimate, you are literally saying it lacks a soul. And that is the original Greek usage. So soul, for Aristotle, you could put it this way, is that which makes a living thing living. And we can, for instance, compare it, therefore, to manness. Manness is the essence of man, that which makes a thing a man. Well, similarly, soul, we might say, is the livingness of an organism, the essence of a living thing, that which makes it a living thing. Well, what makes a thing the kind of thing it is? You know, it's always its form. And so if manness is the form of any particular man, soul is the form of a living thing. And the body, conversely, must be the matter of a living thing. And therefore, soul is to body as form is to matter. Now we can express the same point in the potentiality-actuality terminology. Suppose we have a handful, about 98 cents worth of chemical compounds. This is in the days before inflation. Probably now those compounds might be worth $5 or $6. And they are so chosen that together they have the potentiality for life. Not the actuality, but the potentiality. Now let us organize them, put them together in various ways into a functioning living body. Now we have actualized their potentialities. Because of the new structure we have imposed, we now have actually the set of vital capacities and functions that before we only had potentially. And that, says Aristotle, is soul, which he defines in essence as the actuality of a natural body having life potentially in it. So soul is to body as form is to matter, as actuality is to potentiality. At one point he gives the example, it's like a mark stamped on wax. The wax is the parallel of the body, and the stamp or structure imposed on it is the parallel to the soul. The soul for Aristotle, therefore, is not a thing, not an entity, but simply an aspect of a living entity. It is the name for those vital capacities which derive from organizing matter in a specific way. Well, now the question is, what is the form of a living body? What does differentiate it from non-living things? And Aristotle's answer is a specific set of biological powers or capacities. Essentially, the power of nutrition, of growth, of reproduction. This is the bare minimum. When entity has these powers, it is alive. And if soul then represents the form of a living thing, its distinctive attributes, then soul must be conceived not as a substance or a thing, but rather as a set or collection of vital capacities, because these are what differentiate a living thing. And so says Aristotle, if the I, E-Y-E, if the I were a complete organism, its I-ness, its actuality, its soul would be its power of vision. If an axe were an organism, its axeness, its distinctively axe capacities, its power of cutting would be its soul. Well, the same thing is true with actual living things. You cannot discover the soul by dissecting the thing and hoping you'll pull out a non-material ghost which belongs to another dimension. It is the name for the characteristic modes and capacities of behavior that make a living thing a living. That's what soul is for Aristotle. Now, this doctrine has many major consequences. To begin with, Aristotle explicitly draws the conclusion there can be no soul without a body, no form without matter, no power of cutting floating free without the material axe, no vital capacities floating free without the entity which possesses those capacities. Therefore, for Aristotle, reincarnation, the soul leaving the body and coming back to inhabit a new body, is positively bizarre. And he is nothing but scornful of that doctrine. For Aristotle, for the same reason, there is no such thing as personal immortality. Now, why I put the word personal in, you'll understand shortly. Further, with this doctrine, the metaphysical basis for any soul-body clash has been removed. Soul and body are two aspects of one integrated entity, as against Plato's view. Now, I hasten to add there is some Platonism in Aristotle's ethics, as we'll see, but it is not nearly as intense as in Plato, because the metaphysical and psychological foundation for it has now gone. There is no other world, there is no metaphysical soul-body opposition, and no personal immortality. Now, so far I've just given you the introduction to Aristotle's theory of the soul, because he says there are various kinds of soul. In other words, various types of vital capacities, which are to be discovered by observing the distinctive types of behavior living things engage in. There are three basic types of soul, according to Aristotle. The most primitive level are the entities which simply nourish themselves, grow, reproduce. All living entities have this type of soul. But one type has only this, and that is vegetables, or plants as we would call them today. And consequently, this set of powers, nutrition, growth, reproduction, is called the vegetative soul, or sometimes the nutritive soul. Next, we observe living things which have all the vegetative powers, plus the faculty of sense perception. In other words, a primitive form of consciousness. And as a result, these entities are capable of experiencing pleasure and pain when the appropriate stimuli reach their consciousness. And as a result, they're capable of experiencing desire or aversion, and in some cases, capable of locomotion, of moving toward or from the object in question. These we call animals. And they have what is translated, unfortunately, as the, quote, sensitive soul. But that does not mean an aesthete. It means a living entity with the power of sense perception. Now note that this soul presupposes the previous one. The nutritive or vegetative soul is the precondition of keeping any entity alive. It makes possible the higher type of soul, which will be biologically self-sustaining and have the capacity of sense perception. Now notice I said it makes possible the higher type. Consequently, we can say that the animal soul is the actualization of potentialities established by the vegetative soul. So, in that sense, the animal soul is on a higher level. It represents a higher degree of actualization than plants. And finally, we reach man, who has the preceding capacities plus nous, the mind, the capacity to think, to grasp universals or abstract forms, to reason. He has the rational soul. And again, this requires the previous one. If we didn't have sense experience, we couldn't abstract, we couldn't reach reason. And therefore, again, the sensitive soul makes possible the rational soul, and the rational soul, when it emerges, is the actuality or actualization of those potentialities, and therefore it's on a higher level than the animal soul. Now, Aristotle investigated each of these souls, each of these sets of vital capacities in detail in his work, The De Anima, the Latin translation for Peri Psyche, on the soul, you see. And in many other works he studied it. But the central one is the De Anima. And here I want to say just a few words on two subjects, Aristotle's views on the senses and on reason, as a supplement to last week's lecture. I had to leave it out last week because you didn't yet have enough of Aristotle's key concepts to understand his view. Now, first on the senses, Aristotle did many notable things. He was the first one to define the five senses, to specify their organs and functions. As I mentioned last week, he was the one who suggested that error is due not to the senses, but to misinterpretation by the mind. I have simply no time to survey his accomplishments in this connection. I do want to mention briefly one element in his account of the senses, however, namely, how did Aristotle answer the Sophists? Now, you remember Protagoras' argument, which I stressed weeks ago, that the qualities that things appear to have, color, sound, taste, warmth, etc., they do only because of the sense organs of the perceiver, that these qualities are not really in the things themselves, and that therefore we never come in contact with reality as it really is. Now, what's Aristotle's answer? Well, the first thing to say is that judging by his surviving works, Aristotle is inconsistent on this subject. Sometimes he seems to agree with the Sophists that if human senses contribute to the kind of perception we have, that would invalidate the perception. And so part of the time he asserts that the qualities we experience, like colors, smells, odors, etc., exist in things themselves entirely independently of human perception. This view is frequently called naive realism. Realism because of its stress on our perception of reality as it is, naive because the people who christened this view think that it is a naive viewpoint. Now, to naive realism thus defined, the Sophists seem to have an obvious answer. Protagoras can say, what do you mean those qualities are out there independent of us? They so blatantly depend upon sense organs, and they vary with variations in the sense organs. How can you say that they are independent? Therefore, part of the time, Aristotle seemed to grant that in some way those qualities were a function of human perception. And then he didn't seem to be able to make clear how they nevertheless were to be regarded as valid. Now, his best attempt on this question is as follows. It's ingenious, and see if you can follow it for about 3 minutes. It uses again potentiality and actuality. The process of sensation, Aristotle says at certain points, is a process. In other words, a type of change. As such, it must be a passage from potentiality to actuality. It is, in fact, he goes on, a dual actualization, a double passage from potentiality to actuality. One which occurs in the sense organ, the eye, the ear, whichever, one in the object being sensed. Let's take them one at a time, and first the change in the sense organ. Aristotle observed, or at least thought he did, that when you perceive, the appropriate sense organ comes to possess itself the particular quality being sensed. So if you look out to see a red object, and somebody looks at the eye of the seer, you can see in the appropriate light a little red image on the eyeball. It appears that the eye itself is temporarily reddened. Or if you put your hand into hot water to sense its temperature and then touch the hand itself, it seems to have acquired the quality that it's sensing, to have become warm itself. You can yourself project the experience of tasting someone's tongue having eaten cherry pie, etc. But it also presumably acquires the same quality as the taste it's experiencing. So, on the side of the perceiver, sensation for Aristotle is a process in which the quality being perceived is actually reproduced in the perceiving organ. The organ, prior to the perception, has the capacity, the potentiality, to be characterized by quality X, and sensing is the process in which that quality becomes actualized in the organ. Now, Aristotle goes on, there is an equivalent process taking place in the object, in the thing in reality, that which you are perceiving. Before you perceive a red object, take that as an example, before you do, in itself, he says, it is not actually red. To this extent, the Sophists are correct. Actual redness is somehow a function of our human form of perception and wouldn't exist if there were no human perceivers. And the same for taste, sounds, etc. But, and here is his big disagreement with the Sophists, the object in reality has, in fact, a certain potentiality. It has the potentiality of being perceived in a certain way by a human perceiver. And that is a real fact about the object. It is the kind of object which can, given a certain perceiver, be perceived as red or hot or whatever, as against the kind of object which in fact cannot, which can only be perceived as, for instance, yellow or cold or whatever. Now, in the process of sensation, says Aristotle, this potentiality of the object is actualized. The object which can be seen, for instance, as red comes to be actually seen as red. The object which has the potentiality to be perceived as cold becomes an object which is actually perceived as cold. So sense perception involves a dual actualization of the potentialities of the sense organ and of the object. Perception, therefore, is in contact with reality, because in perception the object itself passes from potentiality to actuality. And at the end, you see it as it actually is. So that redness, for instance, doesn't actually exist on this doctrine, except when we perceive. But when we perceive, it does actually exist, because our perception actualizes the potentiality of the object to be seen as red. You got that? Now, those of you who are familiar with the objectivist theory of sense perception will be able to see that Aristotle's heart here is certainly in the right place. And that if you suitably developed his position, his theory on this issue would be the same as the objectivist position. However, I must say that as Aristotle himself formulated this answer, and I've given you the gist of it, it is not fully satisfactory. It wouldn't and didn't stop the Sophists. You need to say more than this, because their immediate comeback was, oh, well, that's all very fine. We agree with you that in perception, an object which has the potentiality to be seen as red actually is seen as red. In that sense, the Sophist says, okay, there is a passage from potentiality to actuality. But they say the big question is, when we see the object as red, does that mean that in itself it actually is red, apart from us? Of course, the skeptic says we perceive things as we perceive them. But what we want to know is, are things in themselves actually the way we perceive them? Or is all we can say is, this is the way we see objects, but who knows what they really are in themselves apart from us? Now, to this objection, Aristotle offers no explicit defensible answer, at least in his surviving works. And in this sense, his views on the senses, though certainly a huge step in the right direction, are deficient. As for the objectivist answer on this issue, you know I've promised you that for Lecture 12. Now I want to turn briefly to a few words on Aristotle's conception of the process by which nous, or reason, operates. In other words, the process distinctive to man of abstract, rational, conceptual thought. Now, Aristotle thought of the process of thought on the model of the process of sensation. Just as in sensation, your organ actually acquires itself the quality being sensed, you actually suck in, so to speak, the sensory quality being perceived, so on the level of abstract thought. In thought, says Aristotle, you in effect suck into your mind, you imbibe or receive the forms of things, the abstract essences or universals into your mind and become part of it, just as in sense experience, the sensory qualities enter your organ and become part of it. And indeed, sometimes in terms of his own scheme, Aristotle contrasts, of all things, thinking with eating. See, eating being one of the central functions of the vegetative soul. And he does it very sweetly as follows. In eating, in nutrition, you take in the matter of things, but you incorporate that into your body, but the form is irrelevant, so you in effect metaphorically spit out or discard the form. But in thinking, you do the reverse. You take in the forms of things, the abstractions, incorporate them into your mind, but the matter is irrelevant, so you discard or ignore it. So in a very literal sense for Aristotle, but a very literal sense, thinking is a process of becoming informed. You get it? The abstract form actually comes into your mind. You know. And that's where we get the term information, you know. Now, says Aristotle, to go on to another point here, the mind must be capable of receiving all forms. Nothing in the universe is closed to it. Everything is knowable by human concepts. What then must be the nature of the mind in itself if it is to be able to receive, without any distortion, the forms of everything, all kinds of forms throughout the whole universe? Well, in a word, Aristotle seems to answer, the mind can have no structure or nature of its own. Because he seems to argue, if the mind did have a specific nature or structure of its own, if it had any identity prior to the act of thinking, how could we ever know by the use of human reason things as they really are in themselves? If the human mind had a distinctive nature of its own, wouldn't we always be open to the objection, well, we are then just grasping the world as we, as human beings, have to grasp it, given our particular kind of thinking mechanism. So our knowledge would just be subjective, true only for human beings. In other words, the view that Kant made his official philosophy thousands of years later. Now, apparently to escape this conclusion, Aristotle seems to have drawn the conclusion that the human mind, the abstract conceptual faculty in itself, has no nature or identity at all. He says that in itself it is nothing at all actually before it starts to think. And therefore there's nothing about it to distort or alter the data of reality. In itself, he says, the mind is simply potentiality, the capacity for receiving the forms, but nothing actual. It is, he says, the place of forms. Now he seems also to have been influenced by Plato on this question. If you recall, Plato wanted a place, a medium, in which his supernatural forms could be reflected. And he argued that it must be empty space, nothing, non-being. Partly, Plato argued for this on the grounds that only a thing without any form of its own would be suitable for receiving all forms. Well, Aristotle seems to have taken over this doctrine and translated it from cosmology to psychology, and argued that the mind, in effect, is like Plato's empty space, a nothing which can receive all forms. Now, this I interject, and I think you can see very easily, is a very dubious doctrine on Aristotle's part. If the mind is nothing in itself, how can it think? How can it do anything? What about the law of identity, which decrees that everything, including the mind, has an identity, that it's something, that it has a specific nature? But of course, as soon as you say that, the skeptics rush in and say, aha, if the mind has a specific nature, you can never know things as they are, only things as they are thought by the human mind. In other words, they draw the Kantian conclusion. You see, there is a tricky question here, and you can understand, I think, Aristotle's problem. It's a brief addendum to our discussion of the senses. It does not raise any new issues. And once you understand the correct view on the senses, the issue of the mind on this point falls into place without difficulty. Now, again, I want to say that Aristotle's views on the question of the mind's nature are obscure from the remaining works. Other interpretations are possible. I gave you, in effect, the standard interpretation, which to me seems reasonable as an interpretation of Aristotle, but I wouldn't deny that you could find other elements in Aristotle which definitely ascribe a specific nature to the mind. On the basis of the existing manuscripts, Aristotle is inconsistent on this issue. And one last word on Aristotle's theory of the mind. Now, this point is only of historical interest, but I mention it for accuracy. The mind, according to the account so far, is sheer potentiality, simply the capacity to acquire or take in the abstract forms of things. But potentiality, as we know, cannot actualize itself. Remember the four causes. The clay, the potentiality of the statue, cannot mold itself. It requires an efficient cause to act upon it, actually to transform it, to realize its potentialities. Well, says Aristotle, the same is true with mind. So if mind, as we have discussed it so far, is the sheer potentiality of acquiring the forms, there must be another aspect of mind, an aspect which operates on the potentiality, bringing it to actuality. Mind in its potential sense, Aristotle calls the passive reason. Mind in its capacity as actualizer, he calls the active reason, A-C-T-I-V-E, the active reason. Now, about the active reason, there is only a few broken sentences in the surviving works of Aristotle. And it is impossible, therefore, to have any coherent theory of what he meant by it. All he really tells us, if you can even trust the translation, because one of the key sentences can be read in at least 4 different ways grammatically, he tells us that the active reason is an impersonal reasoning agency, a kind of spark which operates to actualize our potential to know and bring it to fulfillment. There is, he says, nothing personal about this active reason. It's an impersonal reasoning agency. And he seems to suggest that it's independent of the body, that it existed before the body, and will survive the death of the body. In other words, it's immortal. Now, this little fragment of Aristotle is an obvious carryover of Platonism as far as we can judge. It's a non-material element of the soul which antecedes and succeeds the body, and is therefore in direct conflict with Aristotle's distinctive theory of the soul. But this view is there, and you should at least know about it, because the later Christians made a great deal of this active reason. You see, they said, even Aristotle, the great lover of this earth, believed in immortality. And the point, of course, is that even granted this doctrine, Aristotle didn't believe in any personal immortality. There was no you that survived, only this abstract spark plug, which has therefore got no psychological and certainly no religious significance. But in any event, that's not how most of the medievals interpreted it. And you see, between the prime mover and the active reason, they could really go to town to show that Aristotle is really compatible with Catholicism after all. Now, philosophically, that is ridiculous. But you can see that the residual Platonism in Aristotle made the medieval task of absorbing Aristotle into Catholicism at least seem possible to undertake. Well, so much for Aristotle's psychology. When in thinking the mind takes in the form of the object, wouldn't that leave the object unformed? Just matter. No, that's just metaphorical. You don't literally suck in the form. You suck in an equivalent of the form. You have the same form in kind in your mind, but not the literal same numerical form. That actual form remains out there. Does Aristotle consider the possession of self-awareness essential to or a defining characteristic of consciousness? No, not that I am aware of, and of course it is not a defining characteristic of consciousness, because there are creatures on the perceptual level who are conscious but do not display any self-awareness. Self-awareness is a distinctive feature of conceptual consciousness, which is capable of turning in and distinguishing itself from other things and forming the idea of itself as against other things. And therefore, it is an attribute of the conceptual level. Now, Aristotle certainly believed that human beings have this faculty. He ascribed it to what he called the common sense, which was the general power of awareness, which could turn in on itself. He himself, so far as I know, ascribed it incorrectly to the perceptual level of consciousness. But I don't know that he anywhere says that's an essential element of consciousness.